I need a wife, tomorrow morning." Boone Mercer said the words in front of God and everyone inside Elra Voss's general store, and not one person laughed. They knew his face too well for that. The man hadn't smiled publicly in 3 years. He hadn't asked anyone for anything in longer than that. And now here he stood, 6'2", of weathered silence, his storm-gray eyes fixed on Elra like she was the last solid thing in a world that had already started coming apart. She put her pen down. She looked at him. And she didn't say no. If this story already has its hand on your heart, subscribe to the channel, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The silence that followed Boone Mercer's words lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, Harriet Colby dropped her basket of dried beans, and the clatter of them scattering across the floorboards broke the spell. Everyone spoke at once. Did he just, Lord above, Boone Mercer, a wife? Boone didn't look at any of them. He was looking at Elra, only at Elra, with an expression she had never seen on any man's face in her 34 years of living. Not desperation, exactly, not madness, but something in the space between the two. A man standing at the edge of something he knew he couldn't survive alone. Elra Voss set her pen down very carefully. She was not a woman who moved in haste, not in business and not in life, and she was not about to start now. She stepped from behind the counter and said quietly, but clearly, "Everybody out." That was the second surprise of the afternoon. Elra Voss did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had run this store alone for 6 years, extended credit to families who had nothing, and collected it back with dignity when they had something again, and there was not a person in Redemption Ridge who questioned her when she used that tone. The store emptied in under a minute. Harriet Colby scooped up her beans with impressive speed and shut the door behind her. Boone and Elra were alone. She crossed her arms. "You'd better start talking." He pulled a telegram from his coat pocket and laid it on the counter between them. He didn't say anything. He just waited while she read it. The paper was wrinkled like he'd crumpled it and then smoothed it out again more than once. Elra read it through once, then again, slower, because some news requires more than one pass before it fully lands. When she looked up, his face told her everything the telegram hadn't. "You didn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." His voice was flat in the way things are flat after they've been beaten down hard enough. "Her mother and we were young. I left before I knew. She never wrote." He stopped, looked at his hands. "She died 3 weeks ago. Fever. The lawyer tracked me down from her papers. And the girl, Ivy, 7 years old." Something moved across his face when he said the name. A flicker of something raw and untested, like a man trying on a feeling he had no experience wearing. "She's on a train right now. Arrives tomorrow morning, 7:15. Elra looked back at the telegram. At the last paragraph she hadn't mentioned yet. "Boone." She kept her voice even. "This says if there's no legal family unit verified by the county marshal by noon tomorrow, I know what it says. She goes to the Harmon County Children's Home." She put the telegram down. "That's 60 miles east. That place—" She stopped herself. "I know what that place is." His jaw was tight enough to crack. "I'm not letting that happen." Elra was quiet for a moment. She walked to the window not to look at anything in particular, but because she needed to move. Outside, she could see Harriet Colby and 2 other women clustered near the hardware store, not even pretending they weren't watching her door. The whole town would know by supper time, regardless of what happened in the next 10 minutes. "Why me?" she said. She turned back to face him. "You could have gone to the widow Parsons. She's been angling for a husband for 2 years. You could have gone to half a dozen women in this town." Boone Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't a man who spoke carelessly. She had observed that much about him in the 3 years he'd been coming into her store for supplies, once a month, paying cash, taking nothing he hadn't earned. He thought before he spoke always, which was more than she could say for most men she'd known. "Because I've watched you," he said. Her chin lifted slightly. Watched me. Not like that. Something shifted in his expression, not quite embarrassment, but close to it. I mean, I've seen how you are with people. The way you handle difficult things without making them worse. The Hendersons when they couldn't pay last winter. The way you dealt with that. The way you didn't humiliate them. He exhaled. Ivy's going to need someone who knows how to be steady, who doesn't panic, who doesn't make things about herself. Elra was not accustomed to being read accurately. Most people in Redemption Ridge saw her as useful and little else competent, reliable, and fundamentally alone in the way that capable women often are. To hear him describe her with something that sounded almost like respect was a stranger feeling than she'd anticipated. "That's a practical answer," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You're also asking me to marry you. That's not particularly practical." "No." A beat. "It's desperate." She almost smiled. "Almost. At least you're honest. I've got no reason left to be anything else." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for anything that isn't in fair exchange. You'd have the cabin, its solid good roof clean well. I've got enough set aside to keep a family through 3 winters without touching the livestock income. You'd have your own room, your own space. I'll stay out of your way. 1 year legal and proper. After that, if you want to dissolve it, I won't argue. And if I don't want to dissolve it?" The question surprised him. She could see it clearly. "Then we'd figure that out when we get there." Elra turned the proposition over in her mind, the way she turned over accounts, methodically looking for the places where the numbers didn't add up, where the risk outweighed the return. She'd made enough bad decisions in her younger years to know what recklessness felt like from the inside. This didn't feel like recklessness. It felt like something else entirely, something she didn't have a clean word for. "What about the store?" she asked. "Bring whoever you need to manage it, or close it for a time. That's your call." "The cabin how far from town?" "Hour and a half on horseback, 2 hours with a wagon." "That's isolated." "Yes." He didn't apologize for it. She respected that. "The girl." Elra paused. "She doesn't know about this arrangement." "She doesn't know me at all," he said quietly. "I'm a stranger to her. Her mother's been gone 3 weeks and she's on a train to meet a father she's never seen. She doesn't need to know the details of what her father had to do to keep her out of an institution. She just needs to know she's going somewhere safe." Now here is the thing that Elra Voss had not said. The thing she had not said to anyone in Redemption Ridge in 6 years of keeping shop and keeping her own counsel. It sat at the back of her throat now, as it always did when the truth got close enough to matter. She had been planning to leave Redemption Ridge, not dramatically, not in a rush, but the lease on the store came up at year's end, and she had been looking at the numbers with the quiet certainty of a woman who understands when something is finished. The store was surviving. It wasn't living, and neither, if she was honest with herself in the dark hours, was she. She had 34 years and enough savings to start something elsewhere. The problem was she had no idea what elsewhere looked like. She had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for something to interrupt the path she was on. She had not expected it to walk in wearing a battered hat and 6 years' worth of silence. The door to the store opened. Both of them turned. It was Tom Breck, Redemption Ridge's self-appointed moral authority, a man with strong opinions on everything and useful thoughts on nothing, who ran the dry goods operation 2 streets over and had been eyeing Elra's store with competitive interest since the day she'd opened it. "I heard," he said in the voice of a man who considers eavesdropping a civic duty. "I think you ought to know, Elra, that this man," he pointed at Boone, "has not been right in the head since he came back from wherever he was, and whatever he's asking you to do, it's not respectable." Boone looked at Tom Breck with the kind of patience that has a definite end. "This is a private conversation," Boone said. "Nothing's private in this town." "It will be," Elra said, "when you close that door on your way out." Tom Breck drew himself up. "Now listen here. Tom." Her voice was pleasant. Absolutely implacably pleasant. "I have extended you credit 6 times in the last 2 years. I have done it quietly, and I have kept it quiet. I can continue to keep it quiet. But you leaving my store right now is a condition of that continuing." Tom Breck left. The door clicked shut behind him with a sound that was almost apologetic. Boone stared at the closed door, then at Elra. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." She picked up the telegram again, studied it one more time. "Tell me about the cabin." Something in him shifted a slight easing, like a man who's been holding his breath and has just been given permission to stop. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft. Stone fireplace. I built it 4 years ago when I... He stopped. "When you... what?" He looked at her directly. "When I thought I might want a life worth coming home to." Turned out I didn't know yet what that meant. Elra absorbed that. It was more than she'd expected him to say, and from his expression, more than he'd intended. "The cabin has a second bedroom?" she asked, bringing the conversation back to solid ground. "I'll build one before next month. For now, Ivy can have the loft. I'll take the main room and you..." He paused. "You get the back room. It's got a good window. Faces east." "I like east-facing windows." "I know." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer immediately. "Then, you open your store at 6:30 every morning. But sometimes before that you stand in the doorway and face east." I noticed. The air in the room had changed. It had been transactional, and now it was something else, something harder to name and harder to dismiss. "This is a very strange situation," Elra said. "Yes." I could say no. "Yes?" He looked at her steadily. "I won't beg, Elra. I won't manipulate you or make promises I can't keep. But I need you to understand that girl on the train, she's coming either way. Tomorrow morning, 7:15. And if I walk into that station as an unmarried man with a history the marshal doesn't think much of, I will lose her before I ever have a chance to know her. And she..." His voice changed in a way that was barely perceptible, but entirely real. "She will spend the years that shape her inside a system that isn't made for children like her." "What do you mean, children like her?" Her mother's letters talked about her, in the lawyer's papers. He reached back into his coat and produced a folded sheet, different from the telegram, older handwritten. He placed it on the counter. "She sent these to the lawyer to pass on in case something happened. She wrote about Ivy." Elra unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved across the page. The woman's handwriting was neat and careful and full of love. She described a little girl who collected feathers and kept them in a tin box, who asked questions about everything and forgot nothing, who had nightmares sometimes and needed someone to sit with her until they passed, who was stubborn and bright and funny and tender, who had her mother wrote her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a heart God willing entirely her own. When Elra finished reading, she folded the letter back along its creases and set it down. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. "She sounds," Elra said, "like a lot of work." Boone made a sound that was the rough approximation of a man who had forgotten how to laugh, but remembered the shape of it. "Yeah. Children who ask questions about everything and forget nothing," Elra continued, "are the best kind and the most exhausting kind simultaneously." "You sound like you know." "I was one." She looked up at him. "My mother spent half my childhood threatening to trade me in for a quieter model." "Did she mean it?" "Never." A pause. But I understood why she considered it. They stood in the quiet of the empty store with the late afternoon light coming through the windows. 2 people who had chosen solitude, and were now standing at the edge of the opposite of that, looking at each other with the kind of careful honesty that only happens when there's too much at stake for pretense. "I'll need to make arrangements for the store," Elra said. "Jenny Marsh has been asking me for work. She's capable." Boone went very still. "Is that a yes?" Elra picked up the pen she had set down when he'd first walked in. She pulled her ledger toward her, open to a fresh page, and wrote 2 words at the top: terms, agreement. "It's a yes with conditions," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He did it the way a man sits when he's been told he might actually get what he came for, carefully, like the chair might not hold. "1 year," she said. "Legal marriage, as you said. After 1 year I decide whether I want to continue or dissolve it. You said you'd agree to that. I agree. The cabin is mine to run as I see fit within it. You don't override my decisions about the household or about Ivy's care without talking to me first. I'm not a decoration. If I'm in this, I'm in it fully. Agreed. I'll need funds for books and supplies for the girl. Proper ones, not cast-offs. I'll get whatever she needs. And one more thing. Elra put down her pen and looked at him squarely. I'm going to ask you something, and I need the truth. Not the version you'd tell the marshal. The actual truth. Boone met her eyes without flinching. Ask. Your history with the law. She kept her voice even. The marshal mentioned you to me once in a context I won't explain. I didn't ask questions then. I'm asking now. Is there anything that would endanger that girl or me if I came to that cabin? The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. There was a time, Boone said slowly and with precision, when I made choices that weren't clean. About 6 years back. I was working for a man I didn't know was crooked until I was deep enough in that getting out required things I'm not proud of. He paused. It's settled. The law in this county knows. The law in the next county knows. None of them have come for me because there's nothing left to come for. I settled it with my own money and my own labor, and without anyone's help. He held her gaze. But I want you to know, because you'll hear something eventually in a town this small, and I'd rather you hear it from me first. Elra looked at him for a long time. She had an instinct for liars developed over years of extending credit to people who needed it. You learned fast to read the difference between a man hiding something and a man telling you the worst of himself because he respected you enough to let you decide. Boone Mercer was doing the latter. Thank you, she said simply, for telling me. He nodded once. She picked up the pen. She wrote the terms out in 2 columns, clean, clear, simple. When she was done, she turned the ledger around so he could read it. He read it. He didn't argue a single word. You write like you mean it, he said. I always mean what I write. She turned the ledger back and signed her name. Then she slid the pen across the counter to him. And you. Boone Mercer picked up the pen. He had large hands that had worked very hard for a long time, and he held the pen with a steadiness that told her he was not a man who made commitments lightly. He read the terms one more time. Then he signed. When he set the pen down, neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening. In a few hours it would be dark. In less than 12 hours, a train would pull into Redemption Ridge Station carrying a 7-year-old girl named Ivy, who collected feathers in a tin box and had nightmares and asked questions about everything. The judge, Elra said. For the license. I'll ride to Carver tonight. Judge Hendricks owes me a favor, and he doesn't ask questions when I don't want them asked. He stood tucking the telegram back into his coat. Can you be at the station by 7? I'll be there at 6:45. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. Of course you will. Boone. He stopped on his way to the door. She held out the mother's letter. Take this. Keep it somewhere safe. He took it from her without looking at it. He already knew what it said. He'd read it enough times that the creases were wearing thin. She wrote about her eyes, he said quietly, not looking at Elra, not looking at anything she could see. Ivy's eyes. She said they were the color of river water in early spring. He stopped. I've been trying to picture that. Elra felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. You'll see them tomorrow morning, she said. 7:15. He nodded. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, his back to her. Elra. Yes. Thank you. He said it like a man who knew the inadequacy of those 2 words and said them anyway because nothing else was close to sufficient. I mean that. I know you do. She pulled her ledger back toward her. Go get the license. And Boone? He turned to look at her. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be the hardest day of your life, and you'll need to be steady for her. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he was gone. Elra stood in her empty store in the gathering dusk. She listened to his horse's hooves moving away down the street, growing quieter until the sound was entirely gone. Then there was just the creak of the old building and the distant murmur of Redemption Ridge going about its early evening, unaware that the quiet storekeeper behind the counter had just made the most consequential decision of her life in the span of 45 minutes. She looked at the ledger, at the 2 signatures, at the terms she had written in her own hand, clean and clear and binding. She had told herself when she looked at the numbers at the end of last month that she was waiting for a reason. That something would either come or it wouldn't, and if it didn't, she would leave quietly and make her life somewhere new. She had not expected the reason to arrive in the form of a desperately honest man and a little girl named Ivy with riverwater eyes and a tin box full of feathers. She closed the ledger. She began to make a list, things to pack, arrangements for Jenny Marsh, instructions for the morning. She wrote quickly and without hesitation because she had always been better at moving forward than at standing still. Whatever was coming, it was coming at 7:15 tomorrow morning on a train from the east, and Elra Voss would be on that platform at 6:45, because she had said she would be, and she always meant what she said. Elra didn't sleep that night. Not truly. She packed with the same methodical attention she gave her accounts. What was essential? What could wait? What had no place in a life that was, as of this morning, fundamentally different from the one she had been living? She had one good trunk that had come with her from her mother's house, back when she'd believed she was heading somewhere worth going. She'd used it twice since. It still smelled faintly of cedar and something older, the particular scent of a life she had packed away, but not entirely let go of. She put in her books first, always the books first. Her mother used to say that a woman who packed her books before her dresses had her priorities correctly ordered. Elra had always agreed. She put in 3 volumes on arithmetic, 2 on natural history, 1 battered collection of American poetry she'd read until the spine gave out. She put in thread and a good needle, and the small wooden box that held every letter she'd received and kept, which was not many, but more than most people would have guessed. Then she stopped. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap, and she did something she very rarely allowed herself. She thought about Daniel Frey. She hadn't let herself think about him in 2 years. Not directly, not by name. Daniel Frey, who had proposed to her when she was 26, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and a future that had seemed for approximately 6 months like the thing she had always been quietly hoping for. Daniel Frey, who had left Redemption Ridge without a word of goodbye on a Tuesday morning in October, the same week she'd turned down a teaching position in Colorado to stay. She'd heard he was in Denver now, married, children. She had never publicly or privately let on that it had broken something in her. She stood up. She finished packing. She didn't think about Daniel Frey again. What she thought about instead as she folded her shawl and set it on top was a 7-year-old girl in a railway car heading toward strangers with no choice in the matter. That thought, unlike the one about Daniel, had a direction to it. It pointed somewhere forward. She closed the trunk. She blew out the lamp. Tomorrow, she thought, was already today. By the time the first gray light came through her east-facing window, Elra had been dressed for an hour. She had her coffee made and her instructions written out for Jenny Marsh, who arrived at 6 sharp and stood in the doorway of the store with her mouth slightly open while Elra explained calmly and completely what had happened and what the arrangement was going to be. Jenny Marsh was 22, sensible and not easily rattled. She listened without interrupting. When Elra finished, Jenny said only, "Is he good to you?" "I don't know yet," Elra said, "but he's honest. That's a starting point." Jenny nodded, like that made sufficient sense. "I'll keep the store running. Don't worry about it. I never worry about things I've delegated properly." Elra handed over the written instructions. "The Hendersons have a balance due at month's end. Be flexible if they need extra days. The Brewers get no further credit until they've settled what's outstanding. And if people ask where you've gone," Elra picked up her coat, "tell them I've gone to manage a different kind of inventory." She was outside and halfway down the street when Harriet Colby appeared from across the road, like she'd been positioned there all night, waiting for this exact moment, which, knowing Harriet, was not outside the realm of possibility. Elra Voss. Harriet's voice carried the particular weight of a woman who believes she is rescuing someone from themselves. You cannot seriously be going through with this. Good morning, Harriet. That man is not right. Everyone knows it. He keeps to himself like a person with things to hide, and I have it on good authority. Whose authority? Harriet hesitated one beat too long. I thought so, Elra said pleasantly. I appreciate that you're concerned, truly. But this is my decision made with my own mind, and it's already been made. She kept walking. I'll write when we're settled. You'll regret this, Harriet called after her. Maybe, Elra said without turning. But it'll be my regret. Good morning. She heard Harriet make a sound somewhere between outrage and reluctant admiration. Elra considered that a reasonable reaction and kept moving. Boone was waiting outside the marshal's office with 2 horses and a document in his hand bearing a judge's seal. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but where Elra's sleeplessness had left her sharp-edged and precise, his had left him quieter than usual, which she hadn't thought possible. You got it, she said. Judge Hendricks was not pleased about being woken at 11 at night. He handed her the document. He did it anyway. She scanned it. Everything in order. She handed it back. Marshal needs to witness the signing, Boone said. 5 minutes inside. Marshal Cord Hale was gray-haired and long-memoried, a man who had been in Redemption Ridge long enough to have watched everyone in it do something they weren't proud of. He looked at Elra when they walked in with an expression she read immediately, not judgment, but assessment. The kind of look that takes the measure of a person and files it away for future use. Miss Voss, he said, you understand what you're signing. I've read it, yes. And you're signing of your own free will. Marshal Hale. She kept her voice level. I have been making my own decisions freely for 34 years. I intend to continue. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but the structural foundation of it. He witnessed the document. They signed. The whole thing took 7 minutes. When it was done, Boone held the door for her as they walked back out into the morning, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because there is a particular silence that follows the point of no return, and it requires a breath or two to move through. Married, Elra said finally. Yes. That's a strange thing? Yes. He glanced at her sideways. You all right? I'm always all right. She walked. Are you? He thought about it seriously, the way he seemed to think about most things. I don't know yet. Honest answer. I told you. Only kind I've got left. They walked toward the station in the early morning quiet, and the space between them was not entirely comfortable, but it was not dishonest either, which Elra decided was a better foundation than most arrangements started with. About halfway there, Boone spoke without looking at her. Her mother's name was Clara, he said. In case you wondered, I didn't say it last night. I wondered, Elra admitted. She was kind. When I knew her, she was one of the kindest people I'd met. I was 21, and not particularly deserving of kindness, which is maybe why I didn't stay. He paused. I've thought about that a lot in the last 3 days. And there's no version of it that makes me look good, so I try to think about what I can do now instead of what I didn't do then. Elra walked beside him and said nothing, because what he'd just said didn't need anything added to it. After a moment, she heard him exhale, slow, deliberate, and she understood that he'd needed to say Clara's name out loud to someone, and she had been the person available, and that was its own kind of small human thing. Did you ever come close to something like this before? He asked. Marriage? Family? She was quiet for a moment. Once. It didn't become anything. His fault or yours? His choice. My fault for not seeing it coming. She kept her eyes forward. I had a gift for inventory by 30. I didn't have it at 26. He seemed to understand that she'd said what she intended to, and nothing more. He didn't push. The train whistle sounded in the distance. Both of them stopped for exactly 1 second. Then they both started moving faster without discussing it. The station platform was not empty when they arrived. Elra took in the usual cluster of people waiting for the inbound train, and then one figure she hadn't expected. A man in a dark coat with a leather satchel standing apart from the other travelers, holding a paper document, and watching the track with the precise attention of someone who was there on official business. Not personal. Official. "Boone," she said it low. He'd already seen. His jaw tightened. "County," he said. "Children's Services. They sent someone. To verify." His voice was flat. "To make sure I'm what the paperwork says I am." "Then we are what the paperwork says we are," Elra said calmly. "Don't look at him. Don't approach him. Stand beside me, and be exactly who you signed your name to be this morning." He looked at her with something she didn't have a quick name for, steadier than gratitude, more grounded than relief. "All right," he said. The train came in with its noise and heat and finality, slowing along the platform, with the groan of something enormous coming to a controlled stop. Elra watched the doors. Her hands were at her sides, perfectly still, because there was no reason for them to be anything else. People came off in the usual way. Families, working men, a woman with 2 hat boxes, who looked deeply displeased about something. And then, a conductor stepped down, turned back, and offered his hand to someone just inside the car. A small hand came out first, then a small boot. Then the rest of Ivy Mercer stepped onto the platform at Redemption Ridge, and the breath left Elra's body in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was small for 7, not unhealthily just fine-boned, like she'd been built for economy. She wore a coat a size too large, and a hat that didn't quite fit, and she carried a canvas bag in one hand and held the conductor's hand with the other until her feet were on solid ground, at which point she let go immediately, the way a child does when they are trying hard to prove they don't need help even when they do. Her eyes were exactly what Clara's letter had said. River water in early spring. That particular color that is neither green nor gray, but something found only in that specific fleeting season. She looked at the platform. She looked at the strangers on it. Her face was composed in the careful, watchful way of a child who has learned that showing things too freely costs you. Then she saw Boone. She knew him somehow, from a photograph perhaps, or from something her mother had described. Elra watched the recognition move across the little girl's face, and with it something that was not warmth and not rage, but a complex tangle of both things wound together so tight you couldn't begin to pull them apart. Boone crouched down to her level. He didn't reach for her. He waited. "Ivy," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said clearly and without any shake in her voice, "My mother said you left." The words hit like a flat stone dropped from height. Boone absorbed them without flinching, which Elra thought was exactly the right thing to do, and probably the hardest. "Yes," he said. She was right. Ivy considered him. "Are you sorry, More than I know how to say." The silence stretched. Children use silence as an instrument of measurement, feeling for where an answer gives testing, whether it holds real weight. Ivy was doing that now, and doing it with a skill that told Elra she'd been doing it for some time. "Okay," Ivy said finally. Not forgiveness, not acceptance. The provisional acknowledgement of a fact received and filed. Then she looked at Elra. "Who are you?" "My name is Elra." She kept her voice even and direct, the way she'd want someone to speak to her if she were 7 years old and everything familiar had ended 3 weeks ago. "I'm going to be living with you and your father up at the mountain cabin." "Are you his wife?" "Yes." Ivy studied her with those river-water eyes. "He just got you, didn't he?" It was not quite a question. Elra looked at this child and felt something shift in her chest. Not pity. Nothing as thin as that. Recognition. The particular intelligence of a child who has already learned to see around the corners that adults think are hidden. "We both decided something quickly," Elra said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were coming, and we wanted you to have a home to come to." Something worked behind the girl's eyes, visible and invisible at once. She was taking it apart, looking at the pieces, deciding where they fit. Then, the man in the dark coat was there crossing the platform with his satchel and his official document, and the particular purposefulness of a man who considers himself the final word on things. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'm Gerald Fitch, placement officer for Harmon County." He looked at Elra. "And this is his wife," Elra said, "Elra Mercer." The name came out of her mouth without hesitation, and she was mildly surprised to find it didn't feel wrong. "We were married this morning. The town marshal witnessed the license. You're welcome to verify it with him directly. His office is a short walk from here, and he'll be in until noon." Gerald Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who arrived expecting compliance and was recalibrating for something sturdier. "Mrs. Mercer, my office sent me to conduct an assessment." "Of course." She said it warmly without a trace of fear, which she had long since found was the single most effective response to officialdom in any form. "We'd expect nothing less. The child's welfare is the priority. It's our priority too." She placed her hand lightly on Ivy's shoulder, gently, not possessively the way you do when you want a child to know you're present but not claiming her. "We're happy to answer whatever you need. We're not in any hurry." Gerald Fitch looked at Boone. Boone looked back at him with the stillness of a man who has learned precisely when not to speak. Then Fitch looked at Ivy. "Young lady," he said in the careful tone of officials whose main relationship with children is paperwork. "Do you know these people?" Ivy looked at him, then at Boone, then at Elra. She ran some internal calculation that was entirely her own behind those eyes that gave away nothing they hadn't decided to give. "That's my father," she said. "And that's Elra." She said Elra's name like she'd been saying it for years, which she hadn't, but which was its own kind of answer. "I just got here. Can we go home now?" Gerald Fitch wrote something in his document. He asked 3 more questions about the property, the distance from town, the schooling arrangements. Elra answered all of them accurately and fully. Boone confirmed what she said when asked. Fitch looked between them with the look of a man who came searching for a gap and found the seam was tight. "I'll need to conduct a follow-up visit in 30 days, he said at last. "We'll be expecting you," Elra said. "I'll have coffee ready." Fitch tucked his document into his satchel and walked back toward the train. Boone let out a breath that was barely audible. Elra felt her own shoulders drop a fraction, the one concession she allowed herself. Ivy watched Fitch go. Then she said very quietly, "Was he trying to take me somewhere?" Boone looked at her. The question of how honest, how much a 7-year-old could hold moved across his face in real time. "He was making sure everything was right," he said. "It is." Ivy absorbed that. "Is it?" she said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking as if she needed the confirmation from somewhere outside herself, from someone whose word she was still deciding whether to trust. "It is," Elra said. The girl looked up at her. For one unguarded moment, something in her face shifted. Not trust, nowhere near that yet, but the smallest possible movement toward it. The hesitation before a step. The gathering of some interior courage she hadn't fully decided to spend. Then she looked away. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder with the studied self-sufficiency of a child who has learned to manage her own things. "I'm hungry," she said. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." "We'll fix that right now," Elra said. She started walking and Ivy walked beside her, not quite close, not far. That precise distance children keep when they are interested, but not yet willing to admit it. Boone fell into step on Ivy's other side, lifting the girl's bag from her shoulder, without asking permission quietly the way he did most things. None of them discussed it. The bag simply moved from Ivy's shoulder to Boone's hand, and Ivy let it go. They moved through the station and out into the morning of Redemption Ridge. The town was watching. Elra could feel it from behind every curtain and around every corner, and none of the 3 of them paid the slightest attention to that at all. What Elra was paying attention to was the small shoulder moving beside her, not quite touching her arm. The careful, contained quality of a child who had recently had a mother and was now figuring out what the world looked like without her. She could feel it in the way Ivy walked. Not fragile, nothing that simple. More like a structure that has taken a serious hit and is waiting to learn whether it will hold. It will hold, Elra thought. She would make sure of it, whatever that required. She didn't know exactly what it was going to cost. She was beginning to suspect the answer was considerably more than she had originally planned. And she found walking through the early morning light beside a child she had known for 15 minutes and a husband she had known for less than a day that she was not as troubled by that as she probably should have been. Boone caught her eye over Ivy's head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There are moments when two people standing inside something larger than either of them anticipated simply acknowledge that to each other, no words, just the quiet recognition that they are in it, both of them, and neither one is walking away. That was one of those moments. Ivy stopped walking. Both adults stopped with her. "Elra," she said. "Yes." The girl looked up at her direct as a compass needle. "Do you want me here for real?" Elra didn't hesitate, not for a single second. "For real," she said. "Absolutely and completely." Ivy held her gaze with those river water eyes, measuring, weighing, applying whatever criteria a 7-year-old who has already lost the most important person in her life uses to decide if someone means what they say. Then she gave one small, formal nod. The nod of a child accepting terms she intends to hold you to. "Okay," she said. "Then let's go." And she started walking again toward the horses, toward the mountain, toward whatever came next, with the particular resolve of someone small, who has decided against considerable evidence and at considerable personal cost to try believing the morning. The wagon ride to the mountain took the better part of 2 hours, and Ivy spent most of it sitting between Boone and Elra on the bench seat with her canvas bag in her lap, like a shield she'd decided to keep in front of her, regardless of what the enemy turned out to be. She wasn't hostile exactly. She wasn't warm either. She occupied the careful middle territory of a child who has decided to reserve judgment until she has sufficient information, which struck Elra as an entirely reasonable approach to an entirely unreasonable situation. About 20 minutes out of town, Ivy said without preamble, "Did you know my mother?" Elra had been expecting questions. She hadn't expected that one first. "No," she said. "I didn't. I wish I had." Ivy considered that. "She was funny," she said. "People don't always know that about her because she was also serious. But she was very funny when she wanted to be." "That's the best kind," Elra said. "The ones who choose when to be funny." Ivy nodded like this was an established fact. She laughed at her own jokes too. I told her that wasn't polite, but she said life was too short to wait for other people to laugh for you. Elra felt the warmth of it, before she felt the grief underneath it. The way the girl spoke her mother in past tense with a matter-of-factness that was covering something enormous. Children do that. They talk around the crater because they can't look directly into it yet. "She sounds like she was right about a lot of things," Elra said. "She was right about almost everything," Ivy said. "Except..." She stopped. "Except..." Ivy looked straight ahead at the trail. "Except, she said some people leave because they don't know how to stay. She said that wasn't the same as not caring." The words landed quietly between all three of them. Boone's hands tightened on the reins just slightly, almost imperceptibly. He didn't turn his head. Ivy didn't look at him when she said it, but she hadn't not meant it for him. The trail began to climb. The air changed cooler, thinner, carrying pine and something belonging to altitude and distance from other people. The sounds changed too, less wind, more space, more silence of the kind that has actual mass to it. "Is there a river?" Ivy asked suddenly. "There's a creek," Boone said. It was the first thing he'd said in over an hour. His voice came out carefully, like a man placing his foot on ice to test whether it will hold. "About a quarter-mile from the cabin. Runs cold. There are trout in it." Ivy absorbed that. "My mother said you lived somewhere with trout." He went very still beside her. "She told you about me." "Some things." Ivy adjusted the bag on her lap. "Not a lot. Enough." "What did she tell you?" he asked. He was trying to keep his voice level. He almost succeeded. That you had gray eyes like a storm coming, Ivy said, and that you were good at building things. A pause. And that she didn't blame you. Boone stopped speaking entirely after that. Elra could see what it had cost him to hear it, the particular stillness of a man holding something very large, very carefully so it doesn't shatter in his hands. She said nothing. Some moments need witnesses, not commentary. They arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon. Ivy climbed down from the wagon without help and stood in front of it with her canvas bag and her river water eyes and took the full measure of the place she was going to live. Her expression was impossible to read, not disapproval, not approval. Pure unfiltered assessment, the way children look at things, before adults teach them to perform reactions for other people's benefit. It's solid, she said finally. Yes, Boone said. The roof looks good. I built it right. Ivy walked to the front step and sat down on it and opened her canvas bag. She took out the small rectangular tin dented at one corner lid, secured with a length of twine, tied in a particular knot. She held it in her lap and looked at it, not opening it, just holding it the way you hold things that belong to someone who is no longer there to hold them. Elra recognized it from Clara's letter, the feather tin. She said nothing. Boone had gone to unhitch the horses, but from where he stood, he could see the tin too. Elra watched him see it. Watched his jaw move once like he'd started to say something and thought better of it. Can I see? Elra asked. Ivy looked up at her. A consideration brief, but real. Then she held the tin out. Elra sat down on the step beside her and took it gently. She worked the knot loose and lifted the lid. Inside 6 feathers, each one laid flat and carefully preserved. A blue jay feather. A piece of red-tailed hawk. Something small and iridescent that might have been a hummingbird. Each one perfect. Each one clearly chosen with intention, saved from the ordinary world by someone who understood that beauty passes if you don't stop to catch it. And tucked beneath the feathers, folded very small, was an envelope, sealed. On the outside, in a woman's careful handwriting, was a single name, Boone. Elra's heart did something complicated. She closed the tin gently and handed it back. Your mother kept beautiful things, she said. She said the point of collecting was to save what other people walk past. Ivy ran her thumb across the tin's dented surface. She said most people are too busy going somewhere to notice what's already there. She sounds. Elra said carefully, like someone worth knowing. Ivy looked at her with those direct eyes. Are you going to cry? Not right now. Good. Ivy stood up and picked up her bag. I don't like it when adults cry in front of me. It makes me feel like I'm supposed to fix it. She walked to the cabin door and looked at it. Can I see my room? The loft is yours, Boone said, coming back from the horses. His voice was controlled with visible effort. Ladder's just inside. The window faces north. You can see the ridgeline from up there. Ivy looked at him for one of her long measuring moments. Then she went inside. The 2 adults stood in the space she'd left and didn't look directly at each other for a moment. The envelope, Elra said quietly. I saw it. She was carrying it to you. That's why she was on the train. He exhaled slowly. I know. Are you going to? Not today. His voice was rough at the edges. I can't not today. Let me get through today. Elra nodded once. She picked up her own bag and went inside. From the loft, she heard Ivy's boots moving from one end to the other. Careful, measured steps, taking inventory of every inch. Then quiet. Then Ivy called down without drama. The window does face north. No elaboration. But she stayed up there, which was its own kind of information. Dinner was a study in the specific awkwardness of 3 strangers sitting at a table built for one. Boone cooked beans and salt pork and cornbread with the straightforward competence of a man who has fed himself for years without anyone to impress. He put the food on the table and sat down and said nothing about it. Ivy looked at her plate. My mother made cornbread different. How? Boone asked. She put honey in it. A beet. "I've got honey," he said. "In the cupboard." I didn't think. "It's fine," Ivy said. "I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's different." She picked up her fork. Different isn't the same as wrong. Elra looked across the table at Boone, who was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man being handed something he doesn't yet know how to hold. "I'll remember the honey," he said quietly. "Next time." Ivy ate. She ate thoroughly and without complaint, which told Elra that the girl had been raised to finish what was in front of her, and that she was genuinely hungry, and that underneath the careful reserve was a practical toughness that had been built slowly and would last. Good. They were going to need all of it. After dinner, Ivy helped clear the plates without being asked. She carried 2 things at once, did it efficiently, made no production of it. She had been taught to be useful, and the habit was stronger than her grief right now, which is how grief often works in children. They disappear into function because function is survivable, and the other thing isn't. Not yet. When the table was clear, Boone said, "I'll show you the well tomorrow, and the creek trail if you want." Ivy stood by the loft ladder. She looked at him. "Okay," she said, the same provisional tone she'd used at the station. Not yes, not no. Somewhere navigable between. "Ivy." He said her name carefully, like it was something he hadn't earned the right to say easily yet. "I know I'm a stranger to you." "Yes," she said. "I know that's my fault." She looked at him with the clear, unsparing honesty of a child who has not yet learned to soften truth for the sake of the room. "I know it's your fault too." He absorbed that without moving. "I'm going to try to do better. I know that doesn't fix what happened before." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother used to say that sorry only works if something changes after it." She looked at him steadily. "So I'll watch." She went up the ladder. The loft floor creaked under her, then went quiet. Boone sat back down at the table. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not collapsing, just taking a breath the way you do when someone has told you something absolutely true, and it needs somewhere private to land first. "She's right," he said. "Yes," Elra said. "You don't have to be kind about it." "I'm not being kind. I'm agreeing with her." She sat down across from him. "She's also 7 years old. She just lost her mother. She got on a train to meet a father she didn't know, and a woman who appeared out of nowhere, and she held herself together through all of it." Elra kept her voice even. "She's going to be all right." He looked up. "You sound certain." "I'm not certain. I'm choosing to believe it, which is different, but works just as well most of the time." Something moved across his face. Not the desperate gratitude he'd walked into her store with the day before, but something quieter and more durable. The kind that settles rather than flares. "Do you always know what to say?" "No," Elra said honestly. "I often know what not to say, which people sometimes mistake for the same thing." The rough approximation of a laugh came out of him slightly fuller than the last time she'd heard it. She stood to go to the back room. At the doorway she stopped. "Boone, the envelope. Ivy has been carrying that letter across hundreds of miles without opening it because it wasn't hers to open. She's been delivering a message she can't read to a man she doesn't know because her mother asked her to." She let that land. Think about what that cost a 7-year-old. He was quiet for a long time. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll ask her for it tomorrow." She went to bed. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound she had been half expecting. The particular cry that comes from someone asleep and somewhere worse than sleep. Not a full scream. Something more desolate than that. The sound of a child deep inside a nightmare, unable to find the surface. Elra was at the loft ladder before she was fully conscious of having decided to move. Ivy was sitting upright in her blankets, not yet awake, but close her eyes open and fixed on something that wasn't in the room. Breathing fast and shallow. The tin box was in both her hands. She'd been sleeping with it pressed against her chest. Elra climbed up and sat near the girl without touching her. She didn't speak. She let her presence be known, a person solid in the actual world, not the one in the nightmare. Ivy's breathing slowed, her eyes focused. She looked at Elra, and for one unguarded moment before the walls went back up, her face was entirely open. Just a child who was terrified and exhausted and had no mother left to sit with her in the dark. "Bad dream," Ivy said. Her voice was smaller than it was in the daytime. "Yes," Elra said. "I have them a lot now." "I know. Your mind is trying to catch up with everything that happened. It takes time." Ivy looked at the tin in her hands. "She used to sit with me," she said. "She didn't always say anything. She just stayed. But she was there." "I can do that," Elra said. "If you want." Ivy looked at her with the nighttime version of those river water eyes, less guarded, more raw, the defenses that take energy to maintain gone soft with exhaustion. "You're not her." "No." Elra held her gaze. "I'm not trying to be. I'm just someone who can sit with you when it's dark." The girl considered this. Really considered it, even half asleep. Even in the aftermath of a nightmare, with the particular seriousness that was already becoming one of Ivy's most defining qualities. Then she shifted in her blankets and made the smallest possible space beside her. Not quite an invitation. Not a refusal either. The structural beginning of one. Elra moved closer and sat with her back against the loft wall. She didn't put her arm around the girl. She just stayed. Ivy was asleep again in 12 minutes. Elra sat for another 30, listening to her breathe before she climbed back down. Boone was in the doorway of the main room. He'd heard everything. He hadn't come up somehow. He'd known it wasn't his moment, that climbing that ladder in the dark would have been the wrong move, regardless of how much he'd wanted to. That kind of restraint, Elra thought, was harder than most people understood. "She's asleep," Elra said. He nodded, said nothing. She went back to bed. Morning arrived stripped of pretense, the way mornings always do after a night of broken sleep and witnessed grief, the unnecessary things shaken loose, only the real things remaining. Ivy came down the ladder with the tin box and her canvas bag and her coat already on, like she was prepared to leave if the morning required it. She looked at the table where Boone had set out bread and the honey jar without commenting on it. Ivy looked at the honey jar. Something in her face shifted, small, quick, gone almost before it arrived. "Thank you," she said. "It's there," Boone said simply. "Use as much as you want." She sat. She put honey on her bread. She ate it without saying anything further, but she ate the whole piece, more than she'd eaten the night before. Small victories. Elra was learning to count them. After breakfast, while Boone went to tend the animals, Ivy sat across from Elra and placed the tin box on the table between them. "Can you read?" Ivy asked. "Yes. I know how to read a little. My mother was teaching me, but not cursive." She slid the tin slowly across the table. "The envelope inside is in cursive." Elra's hands went very still. "Ivy," she said carefully, "that envelope is addressed to your father." "I know." The girl met her eyes without flinching. "But he can't know what it says until he reads it. And I can't tell him what it says because I can't read it." She looked at the tin. "My mother said to give it to him. She didn't say he had to do it alone." This child, Elra thought, was going to be extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that is forged quietly in difficulty and surfaces slowly, and then one day surprises everyone who thought they already knew her. "You should give it to him directly," Elra said. "It belongs to him, but I'll come with you if you want." Ivy thought about it with her usual seriousness. "Okay," she said. They found Boone checking the fence line at the near paddock. He heard them coming and turned, and the look that crossed his face when he saw Ivy walking toward him, deliberately choosing to come to him rather than simply tolerating his presence, was something Elra thought she would not forget easily. Ivy stopped in front of him. She held out the tin. "This is for you," she said. "The envelope inside. My mother said to give it to you." She paused, remembering. "She said you'd need it someday. She didn't know when." Ivy's voice stayed steady with visible effort. "She wrote it a long time ago, before she got sick." Boone looked at the tin in her outstretched hands. He didn't reach for it immediately. He seemed to understand the full weight of what was being handed to him, not just Clara's words, but the fact that this child had carried them across hundreds of miles without opening them, had protected them. "Ivy," he said. His voice was different, lower, rough at the foundation. "Thank you." He took the tin. He untied the twine with hands that were not quite steady and lifted the feathers out one by one with a care that clearly surprised the girl. She watched him do it, closely tracking every movement. He set each feather on the fence post, carefully, like they were made of something that could not be replaced. Because they were. Then he took the envelope. He turned it over, looked at his name on the front in Clara's handwriting. He held it without opening it for a long moment. "Can I read this later?" he said. "Alone?" "Yes," Ivy said. Then, after a pause that held something private and fully formed, "She wasn't angry at you. In case you were wondering, she said that too. She said some people break because of things that happened before you met them. And it doesn't always mean what it looks like from the outside." Boone looked at his daughter, at this child who had carried her mother's grace across half a continent, and set it down in front of him with no obligation to, and every reason not to. "She raised you right," he said. "I know," Ivy said. "That's why I miss her." Silence. Real silence, the kind that holds everything in it and asks nothing back. Then Ivy picked up the blue jay feather from the fence post, looked at it carefully, and put it back in the tin herself. She did the same with each one by one, flat and precise, exactly as her mother must have taught her. She put the lid on and tied the twine in its specific knot. Then she looked at Boone. "You keep the letter," she said. "The tin comes back to me." "Deal," he said. She handed him the envelope, took the tin, and walked back toward the cabin without looking behind her. Boone stood with the letter in his hand and watched her go. His back was straight, and his face was composed, and none of it was fooling anyone. "She is," Elra said quietly, "something else entirely." "Yes," he said. "Just that. Nothing else necessary." He read the letter that evening after Ivy was in the loft. Elra sat by the fire with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, present in the way that Ivy had described Clara being present just there, in case the dark got too large for one person to hold alone. She didn't look at what Clara had written. She didn't need to. She could see the shape of it in how Boone sat while he read the gradual loosening of something that had been held tightly for years, a slow release in the architecture of him, the kind that doesn't happen in a moment but builds across a page. At one point, he put the letter down and pressed his hand flat against the table and just breathed. Then he picked it up and read to the end. When he was done, he folded it along Clara's own creases. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the mantel above the fire where he could see it. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. "She was a good woman," he said to the fire. "I believe that," Elra said. "The thing is—" He stopped, started again. "The thing is, she forgave me before I'd earned it. That's either the most generous thing anyone ever did for me, or it's a challenge. I haven't decided which." "Maybe both," Elra said. He looked at her across the firelight. "Maybe both," he agreed. Above them, Ivy's breathing was slow and even. No nightmare tonight. The cabin settled into itself, the particular silence of high altitude and distance from other people, thick with pine and cold air, and the sounds of a house adjusting to the weight of 3 lives instead of 1. Elra looked at the fire and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not safety exactly. Something that lives in the same neighborhood as both, but is its own distinct thing. Something with actual weight to it, rather than the weightlessness of things hoped for, but never reached. Purpose, she thought. That was the word she'd been searching for. She hadn't known how much she'd been missing it until she felt it settle back into her chest, like something returning to its proper place. Above them in the loft, Ivy slept with the tin box in her hands. 6 feathers and an empty space where a letter used to be, which was its own kind of ending and beginning, the way most real things are. The way this whole improbable arrangement was and had been from the first moment Boone Mercer walked through her store door and said the most honest and terrifying thing she'd ever heard a man say. Outside, The mountain was dark and enormous and indifferent, the way mountains have always been, asking nothing of the people who live beneath them, giving nothing freely, requiring everything they've got. But there was a fire burning inside the cabin. And out here in this country, at this elevation with winter coming and 3 people learning how to be something to each other, they hadn't planned for that, was not a small thing. That was everything. The days that followed settled into something none of them had expected from an arrangement born of desperation, a kind of rhythm. Not comfort, exactly. Comfort was too easy a word for what they were building and too fragile. What they had was closer to calibration. 3 people learning the particular weight and volume of each other, the way musicians who have never played together begin to find the spaces to leave room for the notes the others will carry. Elra started teaching Ivy the morning after the fire and the letter. She didn't announce it as school. She understood instinctively that a child who had just lost everything didn't need the pressure of performance on top of grief. She simply set 2 slates on the table after breakfast and said, "Your mother was teaching you to read. I'm going to keep going from where she left off. Tell me where you are," Ivy told her. She was further along than Elra had expected. She could sound out syllables cleanly and had memorized a working collection of sight words with the retentive precision that Elra had already identified as the girl's most powerful natural asset. Clara had taught her well. "Good," Elra said. "We'll start from there." Ivy looked at the 2 slates. "Do I have to—" "No." The girl blinked. That was not the expected answer. "But," Elra continued, "your mother spent time teaching you these things because she believed you could do more than survive. She believed you could understand the world. I think she was right about that. So the choice is yours." Ivy picked up the chalk. "What's the first word?" That was how it started. By the end of the first week, Ivy could read a full sentence unprompted. By the end of the second, she was doing simple sums with a ferocious concentration that made Elra think of something she'd once read, a mathematician who described arithmetic as the one language that doesn't lie. Ivy had discovered the same truth on her own. Numbers didn't pretend. Numbers didn't leave. They stayed exactly where you put them and told the truth about what they added up to. 7 plus 9, Elra said one morning. 16, Ivy said before the sentence was fully out. "Good. Now tell me how you know." Ivy explained it, not the rote answer, but the reasoning underneath, how she'd broken 7 into 5 and 2, and worked outward from there. It was not how Elra had taught her. It was how she'd figured it out herself. Elra sat back. "Where did you get that method?" Ivy shrugged. "It's faster." "It is," Elra agreed. "Write it down. Show me every step." The girl bent over the slate with the intensity she brought to everything she decided was worth her full attention, and Elra watched her and felt the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has found someone worth teaching. Not because the student is easy, but because they are genuinely alive to the work. From outside came the sound of Boone's axe, steady and rhythmic, the sound of a man who works in order to think. He was splitting wood for winter, which didn't need to start yet, but which he had apparently decided needed to start now. Elra had learned to read what the work was telling her. When he split wood ahead of schedule, he was processing something he couldn't say out loud. When he checked the fence line twice in a morning, he was worried about something he hadn't named yet. She was building a vocabulary for him, the way she'd built a vocabulary for her accounts, methodically paying close attention to the details most people walked past. That afternoon, Ivy found it. She'd gone to the small shelf beside the fireplace to get her slate, and sitting precisely where her tin box lived was a carved deer no longer than her hand, made of pale mountain pine, but carved with a specificity that was not just craft. It had a particular tilt to its head, one ear slightly forward like a deer listening to something it hadn't yet decided was dangerous. It was exactly how Ivy sat at the table when she was paying close attention but didn't want anyone to know it. Ivy picked it up. She turned it over in both hands. She didn't say anything. She carried it to the window, where the light was better, and looked at it for a long time with those evaluating eyes. Then she said to no one in particular, and to Boone specifically, who was just coming through the door with an armful of wood, "Who made this?" Boone set the wood down. I did. It's a deer. Yes. It's listening. He looked at her. Yes. Ivy turned the carving over once more. Her thumb moved along the grain the way her mother had taught her to move her thumb along feathers, feeling for the direction, feeling for what the thing was actually made of. Can I keep it? I made it for you, Boone said. So yes. Ivy set it on the shelf next to her tin box, positioned it so the listening ear faced the room, and went back to her slate without another word. But Elra, watching from the table, saw the small, almost smile that crossed the girl's face as she settled back in quick and private and entirely real. She filed it away with the honey on the bread, and the third night of quiet, all the small things she'd been learning to count. That evening, after Ivy climbed to the loft, Boone sat at the table with his knife and a new piece of pine, turning it slowly in his hands. Not carving yet, just looking. What's it going to be? Elra asked. Don't know yet, he said. You wait until you can see what's already in the wood, then you take away what doesn't belong. Elra looked at him over the top of her book. That's a generous philosophy. Works for wood, he said. A pause. Maybe other things too. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in the air between them. Not named, not close to being named, but present the way certain things are present before they've been acknowledged. She looked back at her book. 3 days later, Ivy asked the question Elra had been expecting since the first morning on the wagon. They were at the table in the middle of a reading exercise when Ivy set down her chalk and looked at Elra with the specific directness that meant she had been building towards something for a while and had finally decided the time had come. Are you going to leave? She asked. Elra put down her own chalk. She gave the question the full weight it deserved because Ivy would know instantly if she answered too quickly or too smoothly. What makes you ask that now? Because everyone leaves eventually, Ivy said. My father left before I was born. My mother left even though she didn't want to. Mr. Fitch was going to take me somewhere. She looked at her hands. People leave. Some people do, Elra said. Are you going to? Elra looked at this child. Fierce, careful, brilliant, grieving 7 years old, and already bearing the kind of weight that should never fall on someone that young. I signed an agreement with your father for 1 year. That was the arrangement we made. Ivy's face went careful and still. So, after a year I get to decide again. Elra kept her voice steady. And right now, sitting at this table with you, I can tell you that walking away from here is not something I'm thinking about. She paused. I won't promise you forever. I won't make a promise I can't guarantee keeping. But I can tell you that right now today, I am not going anywhere. Ivy was quiet for a long time. My mother used to say that right now is the only time that's actually real, she said finally. That the past is just memory, and the future is just guessing. Your mother was a wise woman. Yes. Ivy picked up her chalk. She was right about almost everything. She bent back over her slate. The conversation closed in the clean, decisive way Ivy closed conversations she had finished with, extracting what she needed moving forward. Elra picked up her own chalk, and they continued the lesson. But under the table, out of sight, Elra was holding the edge of her chair with a steadiness that required more effort than it appeared to. She hadn't lied to the girl. But she had felt in the answering of that question the full, strange weight of what she had walked into 15 days ago with a ledger and a pen and a signature. She understood more clearly than she had in the store with the afternoon light, and Boone's desperate honesty that she was no longer measuring any of this by the terms of an arrangement. She was measuring it by the carving on the shelf, by the honey jar, by a child's thumb moving along the grain of a listening deer. 4 days after that, Elra heard the horse. She heard it before Boone did. She had sharp ears for things arriving from a distance, a habit built from 6 years of being the only person responsible for her safety. She went to the window and felt something cold move through her before she could name its source. It was not Gerald Fitch. Fitch moved with compact official purposefulness that she would recognize from any distance. This man rode like someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback and considered it his natural state, and who arrived at places as though he owned them before he'd had a chance to verify whether that was true. Boone came in from the yard. He saw Elra's face first, then looked where she was looking. Every bit of ease that had been slowly building in him over 15 days drained from his expression like water from an upturned cup. "Stay inside," he said. "Who is that?" "Stay inside, Elra." She didn't move from the window. "Tell me who that is." He looked at her. He made the calculation that she was not a woman who stayed inside because she was told to, and she could see him making it, and she could see him accept the result. "His name is Harlan Cade," Boone said. "He worked for the man I told you about, the crooked operation. He wasn't charged careful enough to stay on the right side of the paperwork, but he knows everything that happened." His jaw was set hard. "And he's been waiting 6 years for something to use." Ivy appeared at the top of the loft ladder. She'd heard the tension in the voices below and come to the edge of it the way she always did, not retreating, just placing herself where she could see. "Go back up," Elra said without harshness. "What's happening?" "Someone's coming who wasn't invited. Stay in the loft until I come get you. Take your tin." Ivy's eyes moved to Boone, then back to Elra. She read the room with her particular precision, quick, thorough, decisive. Then she went back up the ladder without argument, which told Elra more about how much the girl had decided to trust her than any conversation yet had. Harlan Cade knocked on the cabin door like a man who knows he doesn't have to. Boone opened it. Cade was older than Elra had expected. Mid-50s, lean in the way that mean things are lean, with pale eyes that swept over everything in the room, including Elra, before they settled back on Boone. He carried his satchel the way Fitch had carried his, but where Fitch had been official, Cade was something else entirely. He had the relaxed confidence of a man who has spent years knowing exactly where the pressure points are. "Mercer." His voice was easy, conversational. "Nice place up here. Hard to find." "You found it," Boone said. "I find most things." The pale eyes moved to Elra again. "This the wife?" "Yes," Elra said. She stepped forward, which she could see surprised both men in different ways. "And you are Harlan Cade, old acquaintance of your husband's." He said the word husband with a particular flatness that meant he didn't believe it. "Heard he'd married Sutton. Wanted to come see for myself." "We don't get many visitors this far up," Elra said pleasantly. "What can we help you with, Mr. Cade?" He looked at her for a moment, reassessing. He'd expected to find Boone alone, or at least dominant in the room. He was adjusting. "I have some business with your husband, about an old property claim, a piece of land that borders this parcel as it happens." "Land records are filed with the county," Elra said. "Any legitimate claim would go through the marshal's office." "Of course." He smiled, which improved nothing about his face. "This is more of a conversation between people who understand each other's histories." He looked at Boone. "Don't you think that's best, Mercer? Keep old history between people who already know it?" There it was, the shape of what he'd come for. Boone said nothing. Elra could feel him weighing his options, the way he weighed most things carefully, without rushing, without letting the pressure push him into something he'd regret. "My husband's history," Elra said, "is something I know well. He was generous enough to share it with me before we married. I found nothing in it that changed my assessment of him." She held Cade's pale eyes without blinking. "So if you've come a long way to leverage something you think nobody else knows about, I'm afraid the trip wasn't worth it." Something shifted in Cade's expression. Not retreat. He was not the kind of man who retreated easily. Recalculation. "A loyal wife," he said. "A clear-eyed one," she said. "There's a difference." Cade looked at Boone. "You've got a good one," he said, and his tone made it sound like an observation about a well-maintained piece of equipment. Boone's voice came out very quiet. "Choose your next words carefully, Cade." "Or what?" The casualness hardened at the edges. "You'll report me. I haven't done anything. I'm just a man visiting an old colleague." He set his satchel on the porch rail without being invited to. The thing is, Mercer, the arrangement we had, the one you walked away from, left some loose ends, financial ones. And I happen to have paperwork suggesting you owe a debt from those days that was never properly settled." "That debt was settled," Boone said. "Every dollar." "Funny thing about paperwork." Cade opened the satchel. "It can say different things depending on who filled it out." There it was, the full shape of the threat. Fabricated documents. A claim that could tie Boone up in court for months, drain what he had cost him. The cabin cost him the legal standing he needed to keep Ivy. Elra had been a storekeeper for 6 years. She had extended credit-managed accounts, settled disputes, and learned one absolute truth about leverage. It only works when the other person doesn't call it. "Mr. Cade," she said, "may I see that paperwork?" He looked at her with mild amusement. "You want to read it?" "I handled accounts for my business for 6 years. I read documents professionally." She held out her hand. He handed it over, still amused, still certain. Elra read it. She took her time. She read it the way she read her ledgers, looking for where the numbers didn't add up, where language went vague, where specificity was required, where signatures appeared without proper witnesses. She found 3 such places in 2 pages. She handed it back. "This was drawn up in the last 30 days, she said. "The notary stamp is from Carver, dated 3 weeks ago. The original debt period you're claiming falls outside any statute of limitations for collection in this territory. And the signature attributed to my husband uses a form of his name he stopped using years before the period you're claiming." She held Cade's eyes steadily. "So no, this is not legitimate paperwork. This is a document manufactured to frighten someone you believed was isolated and without resources." The silence that followed had a winner and a loser, and everyone in the room knew which was which. Cade's amusement had gone flat. He looked at Elra with those calculating pale eyes, working from a position he hadn't expected to occupy. "Your wife is thorough," he said to Boone. "Yes," Boone said. The single word carried everything. "I'm going to suggest," Elra continued, the pleasantness entirely gone from her voice now, "that you take that document back to wherever it was made and burn it. And I want you to know that Marshall Hale in Redemption Ridge is a man I have a direct and comfortable relationship with. If you come to this property again, I will make the trip to his office personally with a full written account of today's conversation and my professional assessment of that paperwork." She let that land in the quiet. "Do we understand each other, Mr. Cade?" He put the document back in his satchel. He looked at Boone one last time, the look of a man recalibrating a target that has turned out to be better defended than anticipated. "You've changed Mercer." "Yes," Boone said. "I have." Cade picked up his satchel. He walked back to his horse with the deliberate stride of a man who has decided to leave before he loses anything else. He rode away down the mountain trail without looking back, getting smaller until the trees closed around him and he was gone entirely. Boone and Elra stood in the open doorway and watched until there was nothing left to watch. Then Boone turned to her. He looked at her the way he looked at the pine before he started carving, like he was trying to see what was actually there beneath everything that had accumulated on the surface. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. The notary stamp, the statute of limitations, you knew all of that. I read carefully. It's a habit." She met his eyes. "We're family, Boone. On paper at minimum. You don't let people come to your family's door with manufactured lies and walk away without a word." Something broke open in his face just slightly, just enough to see through, and then he got it under control. But not before she'd seen what was there. Not gratitude. Something rawer than that. The expression of a man who has spent a very long time believing he didn't deserve anyone standing beside him, and is only now beginning to understand that the belief was wrong. From the loft, "Is he gone?" They both looked up. Ivy was at the top of the ladder, just her face and hands visible at the edge, watching with those eyes that missed nothing. "He's gone," Elra said. "Was he trying to take the cabin?" Boone looked at his daughter. "He was trying to. He didn't manage it." Ivy looked at Elra. "Because of you." "Because we handled it together," Elra said. Ivy considered that. Then she climbed all the way down the ladder and walked to the shelf where the carved deer stood. She picked it up, held it for a moment, set it back in its exact position. The gesture of someone touching something that anchors them when the ground has shifted. "Good," she said simply. She went to the table and picked up her chalk and bent over her slate. As if the crisis had been assessed, processed, and filed, because that was how Ivy Mercer moved through things Elra had learned. Not around, not away from. Directly through and then forward. Boone watched his daughter sit down and start writing letters. He stood in the doorway and watched her with the expression of a man counting something he had nearly lost before he knew he had it. That night after Ivy climbed to the loft, Boone picked up his knife and his piece of pine and sat by the fire and began to carve in earnest. Elra sat across from him with her book. The fire made its ordinary sounds. The mountain made its silence. He worked for almost an hour without speaking. Then he said without looking up, "She's going to be all right." "Yes," Elra said. "I've thought so since the platform. Because of you. The lessons. The nights when she wakes up." "She's the one doing it," Elra said. "I'm just giving her somewhere to put it." He looked up from his carving then. The firelight moved on his face, on the lines of it, the gray starting at his temples, the weight of the years that had made him harder than he needed to be, and more careful than most men bothered to become. "What about you?" he said. She looked at him over her book. "What about me? You gave up your store, your town, your life as you had it." His voice was level, but something moved underneath it, something that had been working toward the surface for days. "Are you all right? Here." It was a real question, asked by someone genuinely asking, which was different from politeness and required a genuine answer. "I think," Elra said, "that the life I had was a good life by most measures. And I also think it had gotten very small." She paused. A store, an apartment above it. The same faces, the same accounts, the same east-facing window every morning. She looked back at him directly. "This isn't small." "No," he said. "It isn't." "I don't regret it," she said. "In case you were wondering." "I was wondering. Now you know." He went back to carving. She went back to her book. But the room was different. Something had been named that had been waiting to be named, and the air was cleaner for it. After a while, she looked at what was taking shape in his hands. Four-legged small, but not a deer wider, lower to the ground. Something different in the proportions. "What is that going to be?" she asked. He turned it, studied it. "A bear," he said. "I think." "For Ivy." He paused. He looked at the small, rough shape in his large, careful hands, and then he looked at Elra across the fire. "No," he said. "I think this one's for you." The fire crackled. Pine shavings curled on the floor at his feet. Elra looked at the small, roughed-out bear, unfinished, imperfect, taking shape slowly under his hands, and felt something shift in the place where she had kept things tightly ordered for 6 years. She said nothing. She opened her book and looked at it without reading. Above them, Ivy slept. In the loft. In the mountain dark. Without a sound for the 4th night running now, 4 nights without the soft cry that had been waking Elra since the first. 4 nights of unbroken quiet, which anyone watching from outside might not think to count, might walk straight past without stopping. But Elra stopped. She counted it, the way she counted all the small things, the honey on the bread, the deer on the shelf, the almost smile over the slate, the moment at the fence post when a little girl had handed a man a letter and taken back a tin. She held them like feathers in a box, each one chosen, each one saved from the ordinary world by someone who had learned slowly, and at some cost, that what matters most is almost always the thing other people are too busy going somewhere to notice. She counted 4 nights of quiet. She counted them carefully, and she held them. Gerald Fitch arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday morning, exactly 30 days after he'd walked away from the station platform with his unmet expectations and his leather satchel. Elra had the coffee ready. She'd known he would come at some point in the week. He was the kind of man who kept to his stated timelines out of a need for the world to know he meant what he said. She'd written it on the calendar page tacked above the kitchen counter. 30 days. Fitch. And she'd prepared the way she prepared for everything by knowing exactly what she had and standing behind it without apology. What she had was real. That was the thing that had changed without her consciously choosing to change it. She had walked into this arrangement with a pen and a ledger and the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who understood the terms. And somewhere between the first lesson on the slate and the fourth night of quiet in the loft and a bear being carved from mountain pine beside the fire, the arrangement had become something else entirely. She hadn't named it yet. She wasn't certain she needed to, but she knew what she had, and she was ready to stand behind it. Ivy came down from the loft that morning, already dressed notable, because Ivy, left to herself, would linger in the loft with her books for a full half-hour before appearing. She was dressed, and her hair was combed, and she sat at the table and began copying letters with a deliberate neatness that told Elra she knew exactly what day it was and had formed her own plan for it. Boone came in from the yard. He saw Ivy at the table and said nothing. He washed his hands, poured coffee, and sat down, calm in the surface, the way Elra had learned to read as the thing he did instead of being afraid. "He'll be here by 10, she said. "I know. Let me handle the talking." Boone looked at her. "You always say that." "Because it always works out better." He almost smiled. "Can't argue with results." Fitch arrived at 10 past the hour, a minor power move, the kind men like him used to remind people they operated on their own schedule. He tied his horse and knocked the way he had at the station, official measured, certain of his welcome, if not his findings. Elra opened the door. "Mr. Fitch, right on time. Come in." He came in. His pale official eyes moved over everything: the 2 slates on the table, the carved animals on the shelf, the honey jar, the books lined on the window ledge, the fire going, and breakfast cleaned up, and the room in proper order. Then they landed on Ivy. "Miss Mercer," he said. "How are you?" Ivy looked up from her slate with the unhurried directness that had been her calling card from the moment she'd stepped off the train. "Better than 30 days ago," she said. Fitch blinked. "That's good to hear." "I can read full sentences now," Ivy continued as though he'd asked. "And I can do multiplication up to the 6s. Elra teaches me 2 hours every morning. Then I help with whatever needs doing." She paused. "Do you want to see my work?" Fitch looked at Elra, then back at Ivy. Yes, I would." Ivy slid her best slate across the table. Elra watched him read it. She watched the precise moment when the official in him stepped back and the man stepped forward when he saw the neat rows of letters, the arithmetic with its workings shown, and the small paragraph Ivy had written that morning in her careful emerging cursive. "My name is Ivy Mercer. I live on a mountain. I am learning to read and to count. I have a father and I have Elra. This is where I live now." Fitch set the slate down. "She wrote that herself?" he asked. "This morning," Elra said. "I didn't know what she'd written until you read it." Fitch looked at the slate again, then at the carved deer on the shelf, then at the tin box beside it, then at Boone, who had been sitting quietly with his coffee for the entire visit, and had not said a word, which Elra thought was the single most effective thing he could have done. "Mr. Mercer," Fitch said. "Standard procedure, I'll need a few minutes with your daughter alone." "Of course," Boone said. He stood and went outside without being asked twice. Elra followed him to the door, then paused and looked at Ivy. Ivy looked back at her, those river water eyes steady, composed, measuring. "You all right?" Elra asked quietly. "He's just a man with a form to fill out," Ivy said. Elra went outside. They waited on the far side of the yard. Boone leaned against the fence and looked at the tree line. Elra stood beside him and listened to the silence from inside the cabin, which told her nothing and everything. "She's fine," Elra said. "I know." He looked at the ground. If he decides, he won't." She said it with the certainty she'd learned to put behind things she meant. He saw the slate. He saw this place. And right now he's talking to a 7-year-old who is going to answer every question he asks with the specific honesty of someone who has nothing to hide and no patience for performance. She glanced at Boone sideways. She's more persuasive than both of us combined. He let out a slow breath. Yeah, he said. She is. They stood side by side in the cold morning air and waited. 12 minutes later, the door opened. Fitch came out with his satchel and the expression of a man who has done this job long enough to know when something is genuine and when it is constructed, and who has just spent 12 minutes with a child, too clear-eyed and too specific in her details to be anything but real. He came to where they stood. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. He said it clean, no subtle flatness this time, no pause around the Mrs. I'm satisfied with the placement. I'll file my report with the county this week. He looked at Boone directly. She speaks well of you, both of you. He paused, and something shifted in his face, a brief human thing underneath the official one. She said when I asked how she felt about living here, she said it was the first place since her mother died that felt like somewhere she was allowed to take up space. He cleared his throat. I thought you should know that. He mounted his horse and rode back down the trail. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Boone turned away from the trail and walked back toward the cabin, and Elra saw the set of his shoulders and understood that he needed a minute to be alone with what he'd just heard. She gave it to him the way she gave him everything, without fuss, without ceremony, with complete recognition of what he needed. She stayed where she was and looked at the sky. It was colder than yesterday. There was something in the air that hadn't been there before, a particular sharpness, a heaviness building at the edge of the clouds that had the feel of something coming. Snow, she thought. Tonight or tomorrow. She was right. It came that night, silent, thorough, covering everything. Ivy woke to it. Elra heard the feet on the loft floor. Not careful, measured steps, but quick ones, rushing. And then Ivy's voice, stripped entirely of its usual deliberate control. Elra. Elra, it's snowing. Elra was at the ladder, before she'd fully placed where the urgency was coming from, ready for a nightmare already calculating. And then she heard it again. Ivy's voice, but not afraid. Something she had not heard from this girl in all 6 weeks she'd known her. Pure, unguarded delight. She climbed the ladder. Ivy was on her knees at the north-facing window with her face pressed close to the cold glass, her breath fogging it in small, rapid clouds. And outside, the world had gone entirely white overnight. The ridgeline softened. The pine branches waited and still. The ground covered in the clean, unbroken silence of first snow. It's everywhere, Ivy said. It is, Elra agreed. I've never been somewhere it snowed like this. She turned from the window, and her face was not the composed, careful measuring face she wore most hours of most days. It was wide open. Every door in it flung back. Can I go out? Get your coat, Elra said. Ivy was down the ladder and at the door before the sentence was finished. The cold hit them in the clean wall sharp and full of the particular smell of new snow, which is its own smell entirely, nothing like anything else. Ivy stepped off the porch, and her boot broke through the surface crust, and she made a sound, half gasp, half laugh, and did it again, deliberately, listening to it give beneath her weight. Then she looked up at the sky, at the flat white gray of it still holding more snow. She opened her mouth the way children do to catch what was falling, and Ivy Mercer laughed. Not the small, controlled, almost smile Elra had been carefully counting for 6 weeks. Not the private curve of her mouth over the carved deer or the honey on the bread. A real laugh, full and surprised sounding, like it had caught even her off guard, like something long stored had finally found the door and couldn't be held back anymore. She spun in the snow with her arms wide, her boots punching through the crust with every step, laughing at the cold and the white and the plain, ridiculous, beautiful fact of it. Boone came out of the cabin and stopped on the porch. He watched his daughter spin in the snow and laugh, and something happened to his face that Elra had no word for and didn't need one. She watched it happen and did not look away. He stepped off the porch. He walked to Ivy and crouched down and scooped a handful of snow and held it out. Ivy looked at it, looked at him, and then she took a handful of her own and threw it at him. Without warning, caught him square in the chest. And Boone made a sound. A real sound. A laugh that was nothing like the approximations he'd been producing for 6 weeks. An actual laugh from somewhere genuine and long unvisited, louder than Elra had thought him capable of. He threw a handful back. Ivy shrieked and ran. He chased her through the snow, and she ran in circles laughing, and he was laughing too. And Elra stood on the porch in the cold morning and watched these two people. The man who had walked into her store, desperate and silent, and the girl who had stepped off a train holding a tin box, and her grief and everything composed and contained. She watched them running through the snow together and felt something complete itself inside her chest. The word she'd been searching for, she thought, for what this was, for what it had become. This was the word. Right here. She went inside to make breakfast. She found it on her windowsill. The east-facing window, the one he'd known she liked before she'd said so. The bear sat on the sill where the morning light would find it first. She'd watched it take shape evening by evening beside the fire for weeks, but finished it was something different. Solid and patient, slightly larger than she'd expected a bear sitting rather than moving, settled on its haunches, not going anywhere. She picked it up. It was warm from the sun coming through the glass. Underneath it was a folded piece of paper. She knew his handwriting from the agreement they'd signed in her store. She unfolded it. It wasn't long. He was not a man who used more words than he needed. It said, "I know what we agreed to. I know a year was what you signed for. I'm not asking you to change what you decide when that's done. But I think you should know that I don't want you to go. Not because of Ivy, though she needs you in ways I can't give her. Because of you. Because you stood in your store and chose something difficult and real when you could have kept what was safe. Because you read a fabricated document and dismantled it in 2 minutes without raising your voice. Because you sit with my daughter in the dark until she finds her way back. I think you should know that. You don't have to answer this. I just needed you to know." Elra stood at the east-facing window with the bear in one hand and the paper in the other, and the snow coming down outside, and the sound of Ivy laughing floating in through the glass. She read it twice. She folded it back along its creases. Then she put on her coat and went outside. Ivy saw her coming and launched a snowball that went wide by a foot, which Elra suspected was intentional. "You missed," Elra said. "Practice round," Ivy said seriously. Boone was watching from across the yard. He'd seen her come out. She could tell by the stillness in him, the held-breath quality of someone who has said something real and is waiting to learn whether it was a mistake. "Ivy," Elra said, "can you get the water going for breakfast? The pot's on the fire." Ivy looked between the two adults with the comprehension of a child who understands subtext considerably better than most adults give her credit for. "You want to talk to him alone?" she said. "Yes." Ivy considered arguing on principle. She decided against it with the particular dignity of someone choosing to be gracious, and went inside. The door closed. Boone and Elra stood in the snow. "I read it," she said. He nodded. He was not going to make this easier by speaking first, and she respected that it was the honest position. He'd said what he meant. Now it was her turn. "You're not a man who says things he doesn't mean," she said. "No." "So when you say because of you, I mean it," he said. Straight, no decoration. The way he said the things that cost him the most. Elra looked at him, at this man who had walked into her store 6 weeks ago with a telegram and a desperate honesty, and had not once in all the time since tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. Who had told her his worst truths before she'd needed to ask twice? Who had built a cabin with an east-facing window years before he knew she existed, and who had left a carved bear in the morning light without asking for anything back? "The year isn't done," she said. "I know, but I can tell you how I'm going to answer when it is." She met his eyes fully. "I'm not going anywhere, Boone. Not at the end of the year. Not after." She held his gaze steady. "This stopped being an arrangement about 3 weeks ago. I think you know that too." Something broke open in his face. Not the brief, controlled crack she'd seen before, but something fuller and more lasting. Something that rearranged his expression from the inside and stayed. "Yes," he said. "I know that." "Good. Then we understand each other." He looked at her across the snow, with those storm-gray eyes that Ivy had inherited, and for one full moment, neither of them moved, and the snow came down around them in the silence of high altitude, and something that had already quietly, irrevocably begun. The cabin door opened. Ivy stood in the doorway, still in her coat, holding the wooden bear that Elra had left on the table when she'd come outside. She looked at the two of them standing in the snow. She looked at their faces. She read what was there with the precision she brought to everything worth reading. "Did you work it out?" she asked. "Yes," Elra said. Ivy looked at her father. "Are you going to ask her properly? My mother said a person should always be asked properly, not just assumed." Boone looked at his daughter, then at Elra, a slow breath in. Then he said it with the plainness and the full weight of a man who has run out of every version of himself that isn't the real one. "Elra, will you stay? Not for the year. For good. Because you want to." The mountain was quiet. The snow was still falling. Ivy stood in the doorway of the cabin holding a carved bear and watching with those river water eyes that had seen enough loss in 7 years to know precisely bone deep the exact value of what they were looking at now. Elra looked at Boone. At this man, this place, this child, this life that had walked into her store, dressed as a desperate question, and turned out to be the most honest answer she had ever been given. "Yes," she said. "I will." Ivy made no sound. She turned and walked back into the cabin and set the bear on the shelf beside the listening deer and the tin box of feathers, all 3 of them together. Now the saved things, the chosen things, the objects that had witnessed this family become itself. She stood there looking at them for a moment. Then she picked up her chalk. She pulled her slate toward her and wrote carefully and without prompting in the best cursive she had. "This is my family. I live here. I am not leaving." She set the chalk down and looked at what she'd written. Then she smiled full and unguarded, and entirely her own, the smile of a child who has found the thing she didn't know how to ask for, and found it whole, and she went to help with breakfast. Outside, the snow kept falling on the mountain, on the cabin roof, on the trail where Harlan Cade had ridden away defeated, and Gerald Fitch had ridden away satisfied, and everything that had come to take pieces of this family had been turned back. It fell on the fence line, and the wood stacked for winter, and the creek where the trout ran cold and clear. It fell the way the land out here does everything without explanation, without apology, offering the ones who stay exactly what they are willing to build. And what they had built, one man by desperation, one woman by courage, one child by the extraordinary decision to trust the morning against all evidence. What they had built was not the arrangement that had been signed into a ledger in a general store in Redemption Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon. That had been the beginning, the blueprint, the first sentence of something much larger. What they had built was a family. Not the kind that comes ready-made, or falls together easily, or costs nothing. The kind that is chosen again and again in the small moments and the hard ones, in the honey on the bread, and the night sitting and the letters written and delivered and read by firelight, in the standing beside each other when it mattered most, in the asking, and the answering in the bear left on the windowsill, and the yes said in the snow. The real kind, the only kind that holds. And on the mountain with the fire going, and breakfast on the stove, and a child's laughter still hanging in the cold morning air, like the most honest sound the world had made in a very long time. There was no question, not a single one remaining about whether any of it had been worth it. It had been worth everything. It was everything.